Hello again, this is Kent Morlan and my friend Ray Pearcey here for another iteration of what we're calling the Kent and Ray Show. We had to get together last Saturday and through a technical flub by me, we didn't record our conversation. So we're back today and we've been shooting the bull for about an hour probably and finally decided we need to turn on the camera and maybe engage in a conversation that we can put out there to try to prove we're erudite about something or other. And we've decided we're going to talk about China. I took history of the Far East in undergraduate school in 1960s, and I kept the book. And last year I got the book down off of the shelf and reread the entirety of it, which sort of reminded me of Chinese history and how far back it goes, at least to 1,750 years before Christ, which means that the Chinese have had a society of sorts for 3,750 years. And I was reminded, for example, that Marco Polo, who everybody's heard of, went from Italy to China in 1275, 200 years before Columbus discovered the New World. And when he got there to Cathay, is what it was called at the time, it wasn't Beijing, but anyhow, the major capital of the Chinese Empire in 1275 was the most advanced country in the world. Probably the largest city in the world, too, at the time. And when Marco Polo got back to China and told them what the Chinese were like, they threw him in prison for lying. They thought he was a fraudster. The Chinese didn't want anything from the Western Hemisphere except gold and silver. So if you wanted to go to China and get silk or whatever else they had, spices, they had to take cash or the equivalent of it, because they didn't want anything that the Europeans could produce. So when we, in the more recent history of China, in the last 200 years, China's sort of fallen on hard times. And for example, in the 19th century, the Chinese government was so weak that the British fought a war with them just for the privilege of selling opium to the Chinese people, and the Chinese government lost. And then basically the Chinese government came completely apart in the early part of the 20th century. And the Chinese took over mainland China in 1949 and did a disastrous job of running it until in the 70s, I guess, when Nixon and Kissinger went over there and got them to open their country up, and the United States actually started facilitating commerce with China. But now China is the second largest economy in the world, and their leader, Xi Jinping, has what he calls the China Dream, which I don't know how good this video is going to be. It seems to be blinking for some reason. But in any event,
it's probably because I'm radioactive too.
It's that watch is what's doing it. But anyhow, the Xi Jinping has very, very big ideas about what role China should play in the world in the near future. And the country that he envisions, as I see it, is very authoritarian. They're into AI really big time, and they're using it to track everything that somebody who's Chinese does. So very controlling, not very free. Certainly, you don't really have any right to speak your mind, or at least not in the way we do. And the question is, what's coming? And the United States yesterday, the State Department and Department of Commerce shut down the export of a lot of our technology to China to thwart China's ability to develop its digital industry. And we're in a kind of a precarious place because about 80% of all the computer chips are made in Taiwan. Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan and take over the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if they did, they'd probably just blow up the ability of most of the world to produce computer chips.
Well, I think that it's one of these instances where connections that should be evident are sometimes overlooked. But I think Putin's failed takeover attempt in Ukraine makes Xi and his cadre in China, ruling cadre in China, less likely to move in a precipitous way to take over Taiwan. I think.
Well, the Chinese tried to invade Japan twice.
Oh, sure.
And failed twice.
Sure.
And one of them was they got caught in a typhoon, and that didn't help them any.
And the Japanese exercised dominion over huge chunks of China for decades after that incursion.
Right. After the Sino-Russian War of 1803, the Japanese basically took over a big chunk of northern China, at least what's now northern China.
So I think they'll exercise some restraint that may not have been in play prior to the Ukrainian entanglement or the Ukrainian episode. And in some ways, I read a piece this morning in, I think, Atlantic on the auspicious success of U.S. engagement in the Ukrainian struggle. And obviously the Ukrainians are keeping the Russians at bay, the Russians with superior numbers and superior logistical capacity, theoretically at least. And it's a lesson for the Chinese. It's arguably a different dynamic, but I think both the Taiwanese and the Chinese are on different footing today as a consequence of all of that. But I guess the larger question is, what does the world, the global economy, look like in the wake of Xi's continuing effort to bring China to dominance in a whole series of domains economically, which is the point that you raised earlier, Kent. And there, I would argue that he's had very mixed results, and is unlikely to have the kind of spectacular advantages that he wants to create in that society, in no small measure because he's creating a conformist society that is unlikely to produce champion companies and entrepreneurial talent and disruptors of the kind that are so critical to some of the advances that we've witnessed here and continue to see.
Well, I think it's mixed bag. I just finished reading Chris Miller's book, Chip Wars. And the Chinese are not very advanced in the ability to make logic chips, like the 86 versions of processors that Intel makes. And they can't get the technology, and they can't make it work. You and I were discussing the fact that the lithograph machines that are used to make the modern chips are $100 million a copy or more, and you can't run them without a Dutch technician sitting there with you. So apparently making modern computer chips is really, really technically very, very difficult. and the Chinese aren't there. So they're still buying an awful lot of their computer technology from Taiwan and from Samsung, which is another major chip manufacturer, Intel in the United States, and an awful lot of the programming that is used to develop these chips is controlled by the United States. In other words, and we're getting ready to start building a couple of fabs, one in Ohio and one in Arizona, where we can produce more of our own chips, theoretically. Now, whether we can actually do it or not, I don't know. But, you know, I've been watching a series of lectures by a guy named Peter Zeihan, Zeihan, and he's a geopolitical expert, and he says that the Chinese are screwed. Their one-child policy is going to result in a reduction in their population by almost 50% over the next 30 years, that they're totally dependent on others for oil to run their country, and they are not self-sufficient in food, including right now their swine herd is way down because of swine flu. They're buying pork from the United States. So the Chinese have got some really, really significant hurdles that they're going to have to overcome. And the United States is not going to help them in the digital realm, in my view, which is going to cause a lot of stress and unhappiness. But the Chinese can't do anything about it because they can't. You know, you're talking about a long, long period of development. When you look at, you know, the first 86 chips came out in the early 80s, and they're still using those same chips to a great extent in the server farms of the world. Now, the Nvidia, or Nvidia, Nvidia, is that how it's pronounced? They make that graphics GPU chip that apparently can be utilized in AI machines. And who knows what's coming next. We're not through with Gordon Moore's rule that the processing power of computers is going to double every 2 years, but we're getting up kind of the quantum state on that, aren't we?
Well, yeah, and it's like I believe the Chinese will make and are making an earnest effort to compete with the West in the electronics and then the chip making regimen. It's just that it's going to require a lot of energy, effort, and time, resources that they could use in other realms and won't be able to. The opportunity costs are very high. And it's not just ASML or AS.
You're talking about the Dutch company that makes the
Dutch
lithography?
Company. They have significant allies, commercial allies in the West, and including in the U.S., who are also being encouraged to not cooperate fully with
Right.
Chinese.
Well, we own a chunk of ASML.
Mm-hmm.
United States does.
Yeah, I think Intel has an equity stake.
And that's the only game in town when it comes to making chips.
Well, high-end chips.
High-end
chips with enormous densities and intricate computing capabilities, which is the leading edge stuff that basically defines the front edge of all of these technologies, not just digital technologies either. I mean, it's also material to the progress in biomedicine and genetic engineering and sequencing and all the rest of it. It's a spillover.
Well, you believe Xi is a big impediment in his own right, don't you?
Well, yeah, he's, it's like authoritarians in this century, and more importantly in the last and before that, often believe that they, by controlling in detail state resources and the labor force in determining priorities from high on, they can push a society into a competitive posture that won't happen in other, quote, freer societies.
Well, apparently Xi is a true communist, though. For example, he seems to be at war with Alibaba and Tencent and the other companies that
Exactly.
have been created and have been so successful. The real estate market's apparently in a dumpster over there because they way overbuilt.
Mm-hmm.
They have
Mm-hmm.
these buildings that are essentially empty that they can't sell. So they got a big internal economic problem, I gather.
Well, they have provinces that have enormous public funds at their disposal who are holding loans from companies that are non-producing
Right,
because
that's
they hold real estate portfolios that are now worthless or trending that way, or they've got solar farms, wind farms that are out in the middle of the country, not even connected to the grid. So they're like unused economic assets that come from the fact that you have to coordinate some of these investments in a way that's not possible when Chinese provinces are competing with each other. But
the Chinese Liberation Army owns a lot of companies.
well, they do. The PLA is a big economic player in China and continues to be. They always have been. But I think, again, the major barrier is you need disruptive, iconoclastic, nonconformist personalities and companies in order to lead. And that's been arguably the case throughout human history, but it's certainly an integral part of what American advances and what the economic horizon has looked like in the previous century. I mean, Kent is reading this Chris Miller piece on chips and the electronic industry. And the history of that industry is a bunch of mavericks and strangos deciding that
You mean like Gordon Moore and
like
Royce and
Mr.
those
Moore and
guys?
Shockley and others, and they didn't like the those things that you used to work.
Transistors, you mean?
Well, they did the
Vacuum
thing,
tubes?
Vacuum tubes. You started out with those vacuum
I
tubes.
did
didn't
start
you,
out
man?
with vacuum tubes, 1961.
And the thing about vacuum tubes was they required a lot of energy.
Hot. They were hot.
They were not, in the end, very reliable, and they weren't capable often of absorbing the kind of shocks associated, say, with being in a rocket.
Actually, I
tank.
had a computer that I worked on for 2 months one time trying to find out what the fault was with it. And eventually, you know how I diagnosed what was wrong with it? I took a number 2 pencil and I went down the vacuum tubes one at a time and whacked the vacuum tube with the pencil. And I finally got to this one vacuum tube. Every time I would whack it, the computer would shut off.
Well, it's the origin of the phrase bug in computing.
Yeah, it had a bug in it, and that I used a number 2 pencil to diagnose that.
Well, I mean, it was also true literally, though. I mean,
Yeah,
I've read that vacuum tubes, like most light sources, were a magnet for moths and other bugs.
Yeah, the lights. They had light. They were really kind of, they produced an orange glow to them as opposed to like the white light off of a light bulb. You know, the second generation of stuff I worked on were encapsulated transistors, and they didn't even have integrated circuits when I got out of the military. So that all came after I was in the service and while I was going to undergraduate school and law school. And then in the early 80s, I've got my first computer, and it had an 86 chip in it. And that was my reintroduction to computers. But back to China, you know, as I said,
well, Shockley was the guy who created one of the first chip companies.
Yeah, they went from Texas Instrument to Fairchild, and from Fairchild, I think Intel was the third generation company that they created. And
Shockley was a guy who was extremely bright, won the Nobel Prize, but he was an ass.
Yeah, it's difficult to get along with it.
So 8 of his primary partners and collaborators left. They called them the traitorous 8, did they not?
Yeah.
And this is a metaphor for what rapid development in a society, from a technical standpoint, is all about. You
Well,
need people who are quite strange and nonconformist in order to advance
the
the
guy who
pace.
started the chip company in Taiwan was trained by Intel.
That's right.
He
He was.
left, went there, got the money, set up a fab, and started. And that particular company is different in that it doesn't. It makes chips for anybody, right?
Yeah,
You give them the specs.
we're talking about TSMC.
Yeah,
Are we not?
TSMC. They don't compete with anybody. They just make chips. They don't care who you are. You give
Or
them the
what you're
money.
going to use the chips for.
They
They
don't care.
do products. They do chips.
Right.
Period.
It's a pure manufacturing operation. But the Chinese don't have that ability now, and they want it. And they're not going to get it if the United States government has anything to do with it. And that's going to be a source of tension between the United States and China because they can't succeed without computers, and they're not going to have the computers they want because the United States is not going to let them have them.
Well, but having said that, though, the thing to remember at all times is that none of this stuff is standing still.
Oh, I understand that.
So,
Sure.
this chip and science bill that Congress enacted and that Biden signed some weeks ago is highly material because it's like that the whole chip and micro circuit front is advancing rapidly, and societies that invest in both the technologies and the people and the training for manufacturing and assembly workers, the societies that do those things are going to be where they need to be, and anybody who just stands still is going to be run over eventually.
Right. Well, Moore's law was based on the idea that every 2 years you'd cut the distance that an electron had to travel by half, right?
Mm-hmm.
Half. Well, they're down now they're talking about 2 nanometer distances. Well, a nanometer is a millionth of a meter. These circuits are so small you can't even see them with the human eye. You have to look at them through microscopes. Unbelievable. And the lithography, which is a light source, which is used to basically create these chips, is so technical. I remember that the machine has 487,000 parts, and I have $100 million a copy in it, and you think it's more than that.
Well, I think.
And you were telling me how big they are and what it takes to move them. What does it take to move one of those things?
Well, I want to be accurate about this. I think it takes 40 cargo containers, these things that usually go on ships or sometimes on rail cars or on railroads. And so 40 of them,
How many?
20 truck loads, and 3 or 4 737 cargo planes.
It's a
and
big deal.
Giant
Then you
machine.
have to put it together when you get it there.
That's right, and it has to be right. It's arguably the most complex machine that's been produced on a routine basis, and I think about 100 of them are sold annually.
Got $100 million a copy?
150. I think that's the number that I saw.
Well, this book that I'm reading of Miller's, a lot of the stuff is backdated because he was writing it on the go, although he got pretty close to today because he was talking about Trump, what Trump did with China and started the trade wars.
Huawei. Yeah, right.
All that stuff. But it seems to me that in the end, we're going to succeed because of us, not because of a failure on China's part. And that gets back to the idea that we have to have a better education system than we have. We have to provide better trained, better educated young people, and we have to have immigration because we don't have enough young people in this country, even with a population of 340 million, to compete in terms of engineers against India or China. We need to invite young engineers from all over the world to come to the United States and live and work and participate in the American dream. And if the American kids don't want to do the work to learn what they need to know, that's their problem. but our country has to have the scientists, the physicists, the chemists, the engineers to produce the modern world. And if we can't buy it from offshore, in my opinion. And as we were discussing before we started talking here, the state governments are defunding the public schools. First K through 12 are being underfunded, to have too many students in the rooms with too few teachers, and then the percentage of the cost of a college education paid for by the government has decreased to about 12%. The result is it's become progressively harder and harder for young people whose parents aren't rich in the first place to get the educations they need to be productive adults in our society. It's as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, absolutely. And, and I think we need to also rethink, the resources are inadequate, but we also need to rethink so many of the things that we're doing with education, and to make it a more dynamic and, how shall I say, compelling prospect for kids who don't really see the connection between the future and what they're being taught in the classroom. That's a continuing challenge, I think.
I read an article that Tulsa World published a number of years ago that ignorance is not a strategy for success in the global world. And unfortunately, we are not educating our young people well enough, in my opinion. Education is a lifetime endeavor. I learn new stuff all the time because I am interested and I read. But I meet so many people who, for all practical purposes,
stopped,
are dead letters.
Right.
If they learn anything, it's strictly by accident. And learning is a lifetime process. I have a plaque. This is allegedly Da Vinci. It says, "I'm still learning." Well, I'm 79 years old and I'm still learning. The next book I'm going to read is about genetics. I've already read several on genetics, but I'm going to learn some more stuff about genetics. I just read one on computers, and then I read one on mathematics before that, Chinese history before that. People have to realize that they've got to keep learning.
So for those among you in our vast audience who are interested in these volumes that Ken is referencing, the first is Chip War by Chris Miller.
Wars. It's Chip Wars by Chris Miller.
Is it plural or singular?
I think it's plural. Try either one, you'll find it.
Right, it's out there. Chris Miller is the writer. And the other book, the one he's about to take up, is called As God.
Yeah.
And it's by a guy by the name of Matthew Cobb, C-O-B-B.
He's better educated than I am.
No, well, I think on
he gets
Saturday
his books
only,
for free, too.
Well, unless you count all of the work that goes into getting those. It's a funny way of thinking free.
Well, he has one of the benefits of his job with Apple Corporation is he has this brand new state-of-the-art iPad, and he gets to download all the books he wants onto it, right?
There's some constraints, but yes. It's like, I think there's a personal experiment that I'm engaged in, which is when you have relatively unconstrained access to media, including books, how will you behave and how will you use your time for those resources and balancing that against other things that you're doing in life. But I think the whole society is also in the midst of a giant laboratory experiment. There's more information, arguably, out there than at any point in human history. And much of it is free or heavily discounted. And so one of the questions is, that's been the case, let's agree, say, for the last 5 to 10 years, a different state qualitatively than human beings have ever been in. But can we see the benefits?
Well, I have changed the way I operate. I get up typically between 4 and 5 o'clock every morning, and I make a pot of coffee, and I go in and I get on the computer and start working on my little pet project, morelaw.com. And historically, I have turned on at 5 o'clock, Joe in the morning, and then I'll flip over to CNN. Well, I basically quit doing that, and the first thing I do is I turn on YouTube and I pick a lecture on some subject or discussion amongst a bunch of experts on some subject, and I work on my computer and I listen to these experts discuss these various and sundry kinds of subjects, quantum mechanics, astrophysics, and I'm not an engineer, but I am learning just a tremendous amount of stuff about the universe and science that I never knew before. So I'm basically, and basically with YouTube, you can attend lectures on almost any subject that you're interested in, and it's free. Costs you nothing except your time. Heck of a deal, huh?
It sounds like a wrap to me.
All right, this is Kent and Ray. We've had a great time as usual. Hope you find our conversations interesting. We'll see you in a week or so.